was a time in my life when I was internet corresponding with a man who happened to be a vegetarian. He was what he termed a compassionate vegetarian. That is, he didn't eat meat because he didn't think it was right to kill animals to get it. A point of view I respect, by the way. But I wasn't agreeing with him that I therefore would immediately stop eating meat. He asserted that there simply was no valid counter argument to his view, an opinion with which I did not concur, and told him such. And he said, "What are you going to give me? The argument that a rabbit is not different than a carrot?" And I said, "Well, in fact, I was pretty much going to do just that." Now, for the record, I do think that animals are capable of suffering in a way that plants are not. And I have a concept of cruelty to animals, but not really one of cruelty to plants. However, there are some interesting facts about plants that actually do cause me to wonder a little. In the theme of tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you said, the main point I'm going to be making here with these interesting stories and factoids is that we humans do not actually understand what consciousness awareness is. Science held on for decades to the belief that only humans made tools. But eventually, evidence stacked up so high, they had to acknowledge that this is not true. Likewise, many scientific and religious leaders try their darndest to come up with some definition of consciousness that includes only humans. And the most common way this is done is by declaring that without language, we can't know what goes on inside of an animal's brain. And since we can't see it, we will conclude that it doesn't exist. This is important to people, not only because it reinforces a feeling of separate and special status of humans compared to other animals, but also because the idea of a sense of self and recognition of other selves is closely related to the idea of a soul. Therefore, if we are forced to acknowledge such consciousness in non-human entities, other animals or even plants, then our religious leaders may find themselves forced to answer questions about the idea of non-human souls. From a scientific point of view, we have no clue. I mean, no clue. I mean, nothing more than some guesses as to just how the sense of self exists in the brain. There are some smart people who can tell you just how it happens that you feel angry, just how your brain forces you to breathe when you're trying to hold your breath. How our vision center works and how it recognizes something that it's seen before. But there is no one who can explain how the sense of self exists in the brain. How this sense of self has a sense of time before now and after now, and a continuity of self through that. How it recognizes something outside of itself as its own unique self. We really have no clue. Which means, among other things, you can't just hook a dog up to a brain scan and see if they're aware of self and others. And don't even ask how we physically experience a sense of spirit or the concept of something bigger than ourselves. And this just looking at brains that work like ours. To be honest, while we have some understanding of how the brain works in general, why and how it's able to make decisions and such, we don't have enough understanding of how it works to recognize other non-similar systems that function like a brain. But there is evidence that such systems exist. Like we may know that a large object in space, even though we can't see it, exists because we do see how its gravity affects other objects. So we see things that act in ways that indicate thought, but we find no brain capable of that thought. Which brings me back to my, is a carrot really different than a rabbit question? Some interesting things on that. In the mid-1990s, there was an interesting news story. Police in a now forgotten Southern California town were called to an apartment complex. The neighbors pointed out to the officers the sounds of tortured cries coming from one of the apartments. Sounds, they said, were heard regularly. When the police went to the apartment to inquire, this is what they found. A computer geek had wired a table full of houseplants to computer inputs. Most people probably know that every living thing has its own electrical field. In the 80s, you could buy lamps that you planted a plant in, and you touched the leaves of the plant and it would turn the lamp on and off. So this guy had a row of plants wired to sensors that could detect and record very minor changes in that electrical field. Then he damaged the plants, shredding their leaves or letting them run out of water, and recorded the changes in the fields. Then he wrote a program that would convert the electrical field to sounds and chose tone changes such that when the plants were damaged, the translated electrical signals sounded like cries of pain. He also claimed to the police that the plants knew him and would emit tones similar to the pain cries whenever he walked in the room. Well, pretty much universally considered creepy. There was nothing illegal, so no arrest. It's easy to say, oh, that's nothing. They only cried because he wrote the program to interpret it as cries. But what's interesting is that the changes in the plant's electrical field happen in a consistent way to anything harmful, consistent enough that a program could be written to make it sound like cries of pain. As far as we know, plants have no brain at all and are capable of no decision-making that is not the direct result of chemical reactions. Yet, these plants reacted to being damaged in a consistent way. But wait, there's more. After this was reported, some people did some experiments with plants in their electrical fields, and that found that the plants had a similar response if the plant next to them was damaged, and that the plants actually would recognize the person who did the damage, changing the output in a consistent but unique way whenever that person walked in the room. As far as we can tell, plants not only have no brain capable of memory or classification of an object, but don't even have the ability to perceive a unique entity. It's also known that there are many types of trees, that when one tree gets an insect infestation, this is somehow communicated to other trees, which up the production of insect discouraging chemicals. There have also been extensive studies of mycelium in forests. Mycelium is the entire body of a fungus, many of which have fruiting bodies that we call mushrooms. These large mycelium structures help move nutrients and water around the forest floor, greatly improving the level of biomass in forests that have them. An unexpected discovery in these studies was that trees use this mycelium structure to specifically send nutrients and energy to their own offspring, recognized and selected from other trees and plants nearby, all connected by the mycelium. There was one case of a stump that had no leaves or live cambium to photosynthesize energy. Yet, after decades this way, the root system was still alive and active. The offspring of the tree still had a mycelium connection to the stump and continued to feed energy back to it and drew water from its roots. How the trees are able to direct energy through the mycelium to selected plants, or how they know which plants are their own offspring, is still a mystery. And then you have hive insects. An individual termite barely has enough neurons to run its bodily functions. You put a single termite on the ground and it will wander around randomly until it starves to death. Yet, several termites together on the ground will start to build a nest. Some termites build deep multi-layer condos with air conditioning, food storage, nurseries, and more. Some ant species appear to plan and strategize aggressive campaigns of war against other hives or other insects. This includes coordinated attacks, flanking maneuvers, and logistical planning. Again, without any form of a brain that we recognize as being capable of making those kinds of complex decisions. Honeybees, likewise, appear to have a very limited individual intellectual capacity, yet they are able to communicate the location of a nectar find as well as many details about it. They can count, they can recognize human faces, and can learn to use tools. There's even indications of non-productive play, all things that seem well out of the capacity of the physical brain. Yet, Professor Lars Chitka of Queen Mary University of London, who has done extensive studies of honeybees, concluded, given all the evidence that's on the table, it is quite likely that bees are conscious. And then there's Occupy, an invertebrate with a decentralized nervous system, having a significant portion of their neurons located in their arms. They do not appear to be capable of complex thought, yet they can solve problems, learn to use tools, have memories, and even exhibit individual personalities. There was a story of a lab where the fish in one of their tanks kept disappearing. They finally installed a camera and found that an octopus was leaving its tank, crossing tables in open air, opening and then jumping into the fish tank, getting a snack, leaving the fish tank, putting the lid back on, and getting back home before the researchers arrived in the morning. Of course, any of these could be just chemical decision-making, much like a plant deciding how to grow, and some of them probably are. But our brain is just chemical decision-making. At some point, the chemical decision-making becomes complex enough. You have to ask if it really functions as a brain. Okay, so interesting, sure, but a long way from being able to consider self-awareness, I guess. But we would have said that a plant could not possibly remember anything, much less an individual person. So the best we can honestly do is, I don't know. And perhaps contemplating the awareness of trees and ants is a bit of a stretch. If they do have awareness, obviously, it is in ways totally alien to our understanding. But what about those animals that seem to act in ways we identify as aware? The reality is that it is a legitimate argument that we don't know what goes on inside of the mind of critters. And that just because their actions appear to be self-aware does not necessarily mean that they are. The most common test for animal behaviorists to decide if a critter is self-aware is the mirror test, a test that's just grossly human-oriented. This test concludes that dogs are not self-aware, but magpies are, because dogs do not recognize their reflection in the mirror as not being a different dog. But dogs do recognize their own scent as themselves. So maybe at least a little expansion of our view would be fair, given that humans have about 40 times more brain dedicated to vision than we do for scent, and that dogs have about 40 times more brain dedicated to scent than vision. There are those who think that most animals that have complex decision-making capability and memories have a sense of self, something that, again, without language, is still impossible to measure from the outside. And so some people think that if you're looking for self-awareness, it would be more useful to look for evidence of the understanding that things outside there in the world are their own selves. And I'm going to go with that one, because for one, it really is just hard to say if something is self-aware from the outside. But being aware of others outside of oneself results in external actions and decisions made for reasons not related to one's own immediate need. And once thoughts turn into actions, they can be observed. I, like many people, believe that a sense of individual others as a self requires first a sense of self. We can also look at actions that indicate abstract understanding, a sense of time, anticipation of future events, intentional deception, revenge, cooperation, grief, and more. And I would assert that every animal that lives in interactive groups, that would be a pack of wolves, but not a flock of starlings, exhibits evidence of understanding that other members in the group have their own needs and of reacting to other members in the group that indicate a special attachment, very different than an attachment to, say, a popular water hole, including different levels of attachment to different individuals in the group. And that such groups exhibit emotions and reactions to other members that appear in every observable way to indicate compassion, charity, forgiveness, personal sacrifice, loyalty, and a whole bunch of reactions typically thought of as exclusively human. Elephants and domestic dogs, for instance, both exhibit strong indications of grief over the loss of some individuals. And while maternal distress over the loss of a child can be chalked up to an evolutionary need for maternal support, elephants and dogs don't just grieve for family, but clearly grieve for friends, non-family members, and not mates with whom they have bonded. Many pack animals, including African wild dogs, domestic dogs, elephants, and some species of whales, will go to great lengths and endure personal hardship and risk to help a wounded member of their pack. Hungry dogs will give up their food. Whales and dolphins will work in conjunction for days to help a wounded friend get to the surface and breathe. Elephants will work in groups to help a sick companion stand and then support them on both sides to get them to water. And we have all heard stories of loyal dogs who endure significant hardship to stay with or get help for or to find their human. The great apes also exhibit many behaviors that are very hard to explain with simple evolutionary genetics. There was a gorilla in a zoo who didn't like the way that the humans responded to him. So he started throwing rocks. The zoo had to put up a net. It was observed one day by zoo staff that in the morning, well before the crowds arrived, the gorilla, very calmly, as opposed to the agitated state he would be in when he was throwing rocks, would go about the enclosure collecting rocks that he liked and putting them in his favorite rock throwing location. This may not sound like much, but not only did this gorilla anticipate an event that would happen later in the day, but he made that connection while in a state of mind completely different than it would be during the event. But he knew that he would be agitated later and would want to throw rocks. Chimps and gorillas both engage in intentional deception, giving an alarm cry instead of a "I found food" cry when they want to keep the food to themselves, or acting nonchalant about the cycling female in the bushes when the dominant male comes by. And most of us have probably heard of the gorilla Coco, who was said to have learned ASL, and who famously, when asked about a dish she had broken, said, "All Ball did it." All Ball being a kitten that lived with her. And of course, there are many varied and complex ways various animals create and use tools. Crows really do drop pebbles into a jug of water to raise the level up so they can drink, just like Aesop said. Okay, so I know y'all love me, but you probably don't want me to stand up here for an hour with an array of interesting and well-documented examples of animals exhibiting shame, resentment, guilt, of them extracting vengeance, lying, asking for forgiveness, giving or denying forgiveness, planning for future events, cooperative problem solving, and a lot more. things that most dog owners have seen. Actions that suggest a sense of time, a sense of oneself in that time, and an understanding that something outside of themselves is also its own self. All of which still adds up to one big giant, I don't know. Which is too bad, given that it's pretty important to us. Oh, a lot of us may think that it's not really important to me, after all. Most of us don't really care if we're so all-fired special in the universe. We don't need to find a reason to decide that animals are not self-aware and don't have souls. Religious leaders may be concerned with trying to explain how dogs do or do not have souls, but for most of us, fretting over the possibility that chimps are aware is just not the top of our list. We're not worried that an animal might have a soul. No, that's backwards. Most of us so want animals to have souls. It's true. Most of us don't claim any understanding of how heaven actually works. And to the extent we do make guesses, people have all kinds of ideas. But most people are pretty consistent about how they hope heaven works. We hope that we will have some kind of reunion with the people we loved and lost during our life. Even though heaven is all peace and understanding from where we stand here, still in bodies, on earth, we tend to long for the chance to repair our regrets so we can say the things we wish we'd said, beg forgiveness for our trespasses, forgive them for theirs, to meet those we have wronged and wronged us and find and give peace. But mostly, we hope to be with them again. Do our hearts feel different about our animals? Who doesn't hope to reunite with that dog you've thought of every night for the last 30 years? You know, when it starts to get dark and it's time to let the dog in? Whose lap doesn't long to have that kitty back to snuggle that your lap still misses? I can't help but hope that my little sister got to hug again the little goat that got killed by dogs when she was 11. I want to meet the little hen I accidentally killed when I was 14. Oh, I'm sorry, little hen. I didn't see you in time. It's hard to imagine, really, that we can love something that much and it doesn't have a soul. Now, I've just spent the better part of 25 minutes telling you all the ways in which we don't have a clue. We just can't say for sure that our pet dog is really aware of itself or us as an entity, much less if this would indicate a soul that would come to greet us at heaven's gate. We can't even really make a good case to claim we understand our own souls. But all that lack of surety, while it may mean that we can't say for sure that animals have souls, it also means that we can't say for sure that they don't, which leaves a big door wide open for hope. Blessed be, everybody. Now, if we can have a couple of other ushers, we will have a call for offering. Divine love